Hello, everyone. My name is Asmik Hachatryan. I'm a consultant at the Financial Research Institute of the Ministry of Finance of Russia. And this is our new project called FRI TALK, which is about talking to our friends and colleagues from different countries across the world and trying to keep track of what's going on in the global economy and sharing our experience on how our countries are coping with the consequences brought on by the coronavirus pandemic. And our guest today is Mюриэл Ваксман. Hi, Mюриэл.
Hi.
Mюriэл is the corporate M&A and contracts partner at the Brazilian law firm Tognetti. And today she's going to enlighten us a little bit on what's going on in Brazil, what is the general situation, and how the country and the population is dealing with the virus. Mюриэл, the stage is yours. Tell us what's going on in the country.
So I am isolated. I'm not, actually I live in São Paulo, but I came to the countryside because the apartment was too small for my husband and I to stay in and just do our home offices there with our dogs. The dogs were going crazy, so we decided to come to the countryside where they have more space to run around and we can have more time to work. But everyone, at least most people I know, are trying to be isolated. And the country was partly paralyzed until this very few last weeks. But unfortunately, as you have seen in the news, we have been having a bit of a political and healthcare crisis here in the last few weeks, especially which was aggravated with the coronavirus pandemic. So
I see. So can you tell us a little bit what stage currently the Brazil is on in terms of how many cases you have, is what the situation in the healthcare system is, how many people are getting tested, and so on?
Yes. So our healthcare system, as everywhere else in the world, is completely overwhelmed. We have some states in our country that the healthcare system is completely paralyzed and in a big crisis. For instance, in the Amazon forest state, Amazonas, this week they have tripled the number of cases and people are dying even outside of hospitals because hospitals cannot afford to have all those people together and they don't have enough room for them. So, and of course, and unfortunately, as in anywhere else in the world, the people who suffer more from this pandemic are people with less money and resources. For instance, we have slums in the cities, big slums in the cities of São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, and it's impossible to cope with isolation, social isolation, and being in your house when you live so close to each other with no healthcare system, no system at all. You know, in a slum is very different than having an apartment in a nice city and in your nice apartment. So, and actually we're in the next few days, we're going to go through, according to authorities, to the peak of the pandemic, unfortunately. So far, we've had 50,000 cases registered, which means that maybe we can have more cases. We probably have much more cases that we don't know of. Mm-hmm. And almost 3,700 deaths till this very day, April 25th. So authorities believe that it's going to get worse in the next few days, and people are supposed to be in isolation. Mm-hmm. And as to the testing, we are unfortunately one of the countries which is less tested its population. So for instance, this week we have received 500,000 tests from abroad, which were distributed among the states. The government expects to receive over 10 million tests within the next few months. But of course, if you compare to our population and the quantity of tests that you need, because people sometimes who are not in isolation need to be tested over and over again, that quantity of tests doesn't make any sense to our huge population. And so far, more than 2.5 million tests for COVID-19 have been distributed throughout Brazil. Of this total, 500,000 more or less are PCR tests, and over 2 million are antibody serology tests.
Yeah, basically the ones that figure out if you have the immune system, right, to resist the virus. I see.
Yes.
Yes. And Muriel, I have this question that I wanted to ask for so long. A month ago, I came across a meme on the internet, which was basically a quote of your Ministry of Healthcare, saying that the government of Brazil is fully prepared to deal with the virus and mitigate the consequences. And then that quote was followed by the photo of the president struggling with putting on a surgical mask. And I know that, you know, there is this element of fun and sarcasm and joke in all memes, but how accurately do you think this describes the situation in the country in terms of the efforts of the government to deal with the pandemic? Is it a joke, or is it a real kind of depiction of what's going on in the country?
Two comments. First, Brazilians are humoristic, so we make fun of stuff that aren't actually fun. But yeah, Brazilians love to make memes about what's going on, and we have new memes since people are isolated and they have a lot of time in their homes, so they are preparing new memes with new subjects every day, which is fun, but also tragic, because when you compare to what's happening here, it can be very, very sad. What happens is our healthcare minister, he resigned almost 2 weeks ago now, because of political crisis. We're having a political crisis between healthcare ministry and the presidency of my country. So what happens is the healthcare minister, he was defending social isolation from the beginning. He was saying to people to stay in if they could. If it did not have to go out at all, please don't go out. But the problem is that the president came out, as Trump did, and said that no, our economy is more important, you should go out, this is just a flu, it's not a big concern. That was in the first few weeks of the pandemic here in Brazil. And right after that, of course, he said that the situation was very serious, should be taken into consideration. But of course, with all this political crisis, and he was openly and publicly having fights with the healthcare minister because he wants the economy, which was not going very well actually before the pandemic started. The economy, of course, it's in shreds right now, and he's worried about that. So he was fighting with the healthcare minister to say, no, just try to go on and try not to isolate too much to see what happens. But of course, it's dangerous. And the healthcare minister, who is also a doctor, he said, of course not. So they were having a lot of disputes, and actually the people were starting to support more the minister. So he decided to resign because the political crisis was too big, and that was last week.
I see. And because you talked about this sort of conflict within the government, that reminds me of a different sort of conflict that we see in America these days. You know, like the federal government versus the states. We've been, I think, observing that sort of battle, states tangling with the president who's pushing the idea of opening the country and opening the economy as soon as possible. Actually, the first time when he declared about opening the country on Easter, I think, there was a huge public debate, also among lawyers and specialists of constitutional law, about the distribution of emergency powers and whether he can do that. And because you have a federal government too, it's interesting to know what the situation in Brazil is. What is like this sort of conflict between federal and state authorities?
Mm-hmm. So here the law is a bit different. So what happened is the Senate, without approval from the president, the Senate decreed on the 20th of March or something around that date, the state of calamity in Brazil. So the states followed that, declaring that the social isolation was in order and everything, but we did not need actual approval from the president to do that.
Okay, so it's different from the way it works in US. I see.
Yeah, but the thing is, what happened here in almost 2 weeks ago now, the Supreme Court, because of the issues we were having with the statements from the president comparison to the health ministry, the Supreme Court decided and declared that all states were independent in the sense of determining how they would deal with the pandemic. So each state can decide how social isolation will work and which services are mandatory to remain open and are special services which need to stay open for the public. So, and that's actually a big fight between the judiciary system and the executive. Which is, it's not news because it goes on every day in our lives, as you know, but it was a big, it actually enhanced the crisis because the Supreme Court having to interfere in the situation right now, especially when the president is in a very delicate situation, was not very good for the political crisis, but it was a big blast for us.
I see. And can you now tell us a little bit about what's going on in the government generally? What measures the government takes to support the people, to support the business? Tell us.
Yes, of course. First, we have a lot of measures regarding new laws, but the thing is that the actual laws that we have were not changed. So we have law projects and new measures, legal measures, but nothing in the law has been officially changed, but they approved several measures. For instance, the anticipation of the first installment of Christmas bonuses for retirees and pensioners. Also, they created a system for the suspension of employment agreements, allowing reduction of remuneration for the time that the pandemic goes on. And also, of course, that is enhanced by release of funds from the unemployment compensation fund. And also another measure that comes to mind is the National Institute of Social Security has authorized advance payment of a minimum monthly wage in Brazil, which is approximately $200 now for workers in line who requested sick leave or applied for the benefit. And one of the biggest changes also is the postponement of payment of certain taxes, especially social contributions.
It's interesting to hear. So because our center has started a new project which is about analyzing measures taken by governments in different countries. I mean, I've been looking into this recently, and I think one thing that everyone pretty much agrees on is that packages might vary in sizes, but the arsenal that different governments have is pretty much the same. So taking into account what you know about international practice and what different countries are doing, what do you think is like the most needed, like the recipe, like the best thing that works and that you would like to see it also in Brazil?
I believe that most people would agree with me that countries that are more successful fighting coronavirus have applied the social isolation better. They created more restrict measures for social isolation, and I think that when you do that, the healthcare system is not overwhelmed. So I think that is a good option. And also in my country, which we realized in the last few weeks, that you need funds for scientific research. Unfortunately, here in Brazil, we don't have that much money. Government doesn't have that much money in spite of all the corruption, unfortunately. So we don't have a scientific research fund, a big fund for that. And I believe that if we had, maybe we could fight this better, fight this pandemic better, and maybe we could try and find a solution a bit faster. And I think that social distancing and scientific research are mandatory in this case. I think they're most successful measures.
Yeah. I think that's sort of a ubiquitous consideration these days, that much more interest is coming on part of investors for healthcare system. But I don't know if we can see it now. But speaking not only about healthcare investments in healthcare system, but investments in general, what is your sense? Do you see any change? Do you think that there is an outflow of foreign investments, or do you feel that that has not affected the situation in Brazil yet?
Before the pandemic, we had already a bit of a political crisis and economic crisis. So investors were a bit afraid of coming to Brazil. And now, of course, everything is paralyzed. So nothing's coming in, nothing's coming out. But I've been speaking to some of my colleagues who work with capital markets. And they believe that capital markets within the next year, actually, after the pandemic is over, hopefully soon, capital markets will not be receiving a lot of news on that front. We won't be seeing a lot of IPOs and offers in general. And capital markets here in Brazil was actually a field that was starting to grow, which is unfortunate. But actually, I have some other colleagues who work with M&A, as I do, and they believe that after the pandemic, a lot of companies will be left bankrupt because they have been paralyzed for so long. They could no longer pay their taxes, and they will have to go bankrupt. There's no other option. And they believe that some of those companies which can be still operational will be purchased. So they believe, my colleagues believe, that the M&A in this sense will be a very successful field after the pandemic is gone. We'll have to wait and see, but I mean, I really hope that people won't continue suffering, because we see every day people suffering, you know. And I'm not just talking about the M&A. I'm talking about people who have to go to do their groceries every day, and they don't have money right now.
I see. I think that's one thing that pretty much every lawyer is saying these days, that bankruptcy and M&A are two probably most popular things to do in law. And because you talked about bankruptcy, I also wanted to tackle these, because I think that so many countries today are changing and modifying their rules on bankruptcy. For example, in Armenia, there is an initiative on part of the private sector. It's not yet a bill, it's an initiative, so we don't know even if it will become a bill. But the idea is that people want to suspend state agencies' right to file involuntary bankruptcy petitions against companies. So it's basically tax service cannot go after companies and take them into bankruptcy. Another thing that I have observed a lot is European countries, for instance, changing their rules on equitable subordination of shareholders' loans, which is also a real change in the game, right? Because it's an incentive for shareholders to put money in the company. So is there any news in Brazil in the field of bankruptcy? Do you have any new law, or do you have any initiative to change, or do you have any sort of pressure on part of private companies, private sector, that saying that this is the thing that you have to change?
So we haven't had actual legislative changes to our bankruptcy law. But the government has commenced a lot of measures. For instance, the increase of credit lines, the possibility of reducing wages, and the postponement of taxes. Not only social contributions, but taxes in general are very common nowadays, but they are not enough to compensate the economic crisis which is happening and which will continue happening. So they are planning on a fresh start mechanism for the bankruptcy law. Actually, there is a project law that was introduced 3 weeks ago that has some innovations for the bankruptcy law. For instance, the suspension of effectiveness of certain creditors' requirements for the bankruptcy and the judicial and extrajudicial recovery procedures, the increase of the minimal limit for declaring bankruptcy. And also, which was very interesting, it's a measure towards small businesses. The project establishes a special plan for the bankruptcy and reorganization procedures, providing that the payment of the first installment of the plan will happen 1 year after bankruptcy was declared. So they have a bit longer to start paying their debts. So those are the main measures right now.
Yeah, I was curious to hear about that. Let us see what happens in my country, which is, when I say my country, I refer to Armenia, because right now I'm in Armenia, and we don't have, as I already said, we don't have a bill at this point, but probably there's a lot of pressure coming on, I think.
Yeah, there's no time for new bills, new laws. They're just having these measures, and they're trying to apply them on a daily basis. But actually approving new laws is very time consuming. So we don't have the time.
Yeah. That's true. And because we talked about bankruptcy, and I don't want to end our interview on this sad note. But actually, it's not sad, because you know what? Bankruptcy is about fresh start, right? It's what the whole philosophy of bankruptcy, I think, at least in the Western world, is, which is providing fresh start to the company. So, what do you think is sort of the fresh start? Because today, like, one of the most popular headlines in the newspapers are the world is never going to be the same, or you know, once this pandemic is over, we're gonna wake up different people, because the world has changed in a way that is unprecedented. So what do you think is like the fresh start? What is like the silver lining of the pandemic, and how is it going to affect us in a positive way?
I think the world would never be the same again. We're changing every day, so that makes us different every day. But aside from that, I think that there are 3 things that will change, especially here, as I can see them changing right now. First, on how we actually work. Since we're doing a lot of home office and spending more time actually at home and with family, and maybe because we have this view of this way of life here in Brazil, that means that when you're a lawyer, you're a successful lawyer, means you're a workaholic and you work long hours and you don't have a lot of time for yourself. But I think that maybe this will all change. This will show people that maybe we can do home office a bit more. Maybe we can stay a bit more with our families and try at least to be healthy eventually, occasionally. And that actually, if we stay home a bit more and work a couple of days in our house and a couple of days in the office, that will decrease traffic and decrease levels of pollution. And of course, change the mindset of people that think that working long hours means you're successful. The second thing is about people, how people will actually change. I think that children will learn how to focus on being in an online classroom, which is not easy for me or for my generation at least. And of course, and thinking about each other, thinking about who is in need, who is the informal employee who does not receive his wages because he's not working, because his employment is not formal. So how can we help this person, and how can we help people who live in the slums? How can we, if they need, what do they need? They need every day something, you know. We can maybe help each other on a daily basis, not only when there is a pandemic going on. And maybe that will make us also care more about each other, of course. Not only our close and loved ones, but the other people we don't actually know. And finally, I think, and I really, really hope that we'll try to treat the environment a little better. Maybe thinking about only money and votes and social media and getting enough likes, maybe it's not enough, you know. You cannot eat or live on those. So maybe we should start to taking a look around our world and understand that we live in it, we are part of it, we do not own it. So maybe we should treat the environment a little better, so maybe this will not happen again. This pandemic, I believe, is, of course, it's a consequence of a lot of aspects, but I think that if we treat better animals, plants, and people, everything, I hope, will be better.
Yeah, let's hope so. And on this sophisticated and positive note, let us end our interview. Müriэл, I thank you very much. Thank you for doing this interview. Thank you for telling us what is going in your country. And I hope that next time when we speak, you will be telling me good news. You'll be telling me that this is over, and I'll be telling the same, and we will be safer pretty much everywhere. Thank you very much. And have a good
Thank you very much, Asmik, for having me. And I would just like to state that the opinions here and the statements here are my own. They're not my government's, they're not my firm's. So just trying to keep everyone safe and healthy. And I hope this pandemic will end and we'll be out on the street and happy soon.
again. Yeah. Thank you, Müriэл. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Have a good one.